everybody, can I bring you to order? I'm Meg Russell from the Constitution Unit, here to chair this seminar about our Independent Commission on Referendums. Really delighted to see such a packed room here today. I think you're in for an interesting event. As many of you will already know, we set up the Independent Commission on Referendums last year. It was launched in August and it held its first meeting in October. It is a very distinguished set of 12 individuals who are considering how we do referendums in this country and whether we might do them better. I'm not going to talk too much about that because we have, I don't want to steal the lines of the panellists, but the Commission is currently meeting, taking evidence, and will be reporting before the summer. We've got a great lineup here. We're going to start with Jo Pilling, who is the chair of the Independent Commission on Referendums. And just because nobody else is going to, I'm sure he'll be very nice about the other members, I would like to take this opportunity to be very, very nice about Jo and to thank him enormously for the work that he's doing chairing the Commission. Jo had a very distinguished career in the civil service. He's a former Director General of the Prison Service, a former Permanent Secretary at the Northern Ireland Office, and he has very kindly stepped in to chair this Commission and is doing so with enormous skill and grace, and is also doing so, I think it might be worth saying, without any remuneration, as are all of the members of the Commission are giving their time for free to this important work. So we're tremendously grateful to all of them. After Jo, we will have Alan Renwick, the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, who is the Research Director of the Independent Commission. And then we will move on to Sue English, just on my right here, who is a member of the Commission, to whom we are obviously very grateful. She's a former head of political programmes at the BBC, a post that she held until 2015, and she's had some really useful insights on the Commission about referendums and the media in particular, as you'd imagine, and she'll share her thoughts with us. And then we move on to Sarah Baxter, who we're also very grateful to, because she's not even connected to the Commission. She is the Deputy Political Editor of the Sunday Times. She's a former political editor of the New Statesman, and she is here to give us a bit of an external perspective on what she's heard and on the Commission's work. So the speakers will speak for about 40 minutes collectively, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion. So over to Jo. Thank you very much.
In its infancy, this unit set up a commission on referendums, which I think not just people here, but others generally believe had some considerable influence on the only legislation we have which governs the way referendums operate, which passed in 2000. Since then, of course, we've had a lot more experience of referendums, AV in 2011, Scottish independence, and don't mention it. There's also been a big shift in campaigning since the 1990s, both in elections and referendums. And people here decided that it was time to have another look at the whole thing. And obviously a fairly elaborate mechanism has been set up to do that. If the view had been, the view that people have often expressed to me since I agreed to do this work, when I mentioned what I'm doing now, only of course because they very kindly asked me. Some of them say, well, it won't take very long, will it? Because we never want to have another one as long as any of us live, do we? And my answer to that generally turns on Scotland and Northern Ireland, where there are groups of people rather keen to see fundamental constitutional change, where there have been border polls or referendums, and where a decision, I think, not to have such an event again as long as this country exists would be taken ill by quite a number of people in those bits of the United Kingdom. There are some broader reasons why it's a bit unrealistic to think that we've seen the last referendum in our lifetimes, even the younger people here So I think it was worthwhile to get a cross-section of people together to aim at a publication which would have the support of people with a wide range of expertise and experience. So the Commission is independent. It's independent of government, of course. That had nothing to do with it. It's independent of party. It's independent of the unit itself, although former civil servants like me here will know that those who wield the pen wield a great deal of the ultimate responsibility for what emerges, and none of us really are writing anything except members of this unit. So I don't want to be disingenuous about the fact that it's completely independent of the unit. It's certainly informed by a great deal of hard and scholarly work. We're looking at all aspects of the subject, from, as it were, the broadest questions to the relatively detailed. The terms of reference invite us to look at what place referendums have in a representative democracy, what subjects, what circumstances call for a referendum, what can be said about when a referendum will be undesirable. If we have one, what should its legal effect be? Is a simple majority appropriate in all cases, or in no cases at all, or in some cases? We're looking at a wide range of regulatory issues as well. Who should have the power to call a referendum? How should the government of the day behave, both during, before a campaign, before as well as during? We're looking at everything to do with campaign groups and their regulation. What can be done to make sure that the electorate can access accurate and relevant information in order to promote informed debate and decision taking? It may be a comment as much on a sense that this is not an unimportant subject as on the unit's reputation that we got such an amazing group of people to agree to be part of the Commission. I feel slightly amazed when I think about it even now. It's got amongst its members insight into all four parts of the UK. Apart from Sue, who is going to speak in a few minutes, and whom you'll therefore get to know and appreciate as I do. We include a Labour Brexiteer who stood down at the 2017 election, Gisela Stewart, Seema Malhotra, a Labour Remainer, Cheryl Gillen, who campaigned to leave, and Dominic Grieve, both the latter two held cabinet level posts in the coalition. Andrew Wilson is an ex-MSP who's still a senior figure in the SNP, but now working in his own company with others. Lord Eames, a crossbench peer, brings the added bonus of knowing how referendums worked in the Republic of Ireland. When he was one of the two archbishops of Armagh, he was responsible for the whole island of Ireland, as is the other archbishop of Armagh, and therefore he had to think quite a bit about how referendums worked in the greater part of his patch. Jenny Watson chaired the Electoral Commission until 2016 and obviously knows a vast amount about the practical details of regulating referendums as well as elections. Deborah Mattinson is our great contact with the first Referendum Commission. She was actually a member of it and is a member of this commission, and is of course well known as an expert and experienced pollster. Academic expertise is provided by David Runciman from Cambridge and Martin Moore from King's College London. Martin is one of several members who know a great deal about social media. I wasn't chosen for any relevant expertise at all. My role is merely to help 11 very lively minds to hang together, rather, I hope, than separately at the end of the process. We plan to hold 8 meetings, discussing material assembled by the team here at the unit. We've invited expert evidence, and there's a survey which we encourage any interested person to complete, which can be accessed, I think, through the website here. As Meg said, the aim is to publish a report before the summer break, and I think the hope that we all have is that there will be continued public debate about the use of referendums and their regulation, and that that debate will be better informed because of the work we're doing and the report which we will publish. Thank you.
Thank you. So my role is to take you through some of the issues, some of the questions that the Independent Commission on Referendums is considering. So Joe mentioned that the Commission has some terms of reference, and I'll take those as my starting point. So as you can see there, the role of the Commission, sorry I can't see the screen from here. The role of the Commission is in light of the 4 recent referendums, it's important to bear in mind that we've had 4 referendums in recent years. The referendum on EU membership in 2016, the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, the AV referendum on the electoral system in 2011, and the Welsh referendum, also 2011, on further devolution of powers to Wales. So in light of experiences from all of those referendums, the Commission is looking at issues to do with referendums, including those relating to the broad place of referendums in the UK system of representative democracy, the legal effect of referendums, the role of government during campaigns, the regulation of designated campaign groups, and the provision of public information and education, and the promotion of informed debate. So it's seeking to report on all of those issues. So I'm going to take you through those 5 areas and try to illustrate some of the questions that are really important that are coming up in the work of the Commission. So firstly, the place of referendums is kind of the biggie in terms of thinking about just what role do we want referendums to play in our democracy as a whole. And there are a number of important questions that come up under that heading. So should referendums be frequent? Would we like to see more referendums or fewer referendums? On what kinds of topics? Should referendums be restricted to only a very particular set of kinds of issues on which referendums are desirable? Or would it be good to have referendums on a broader range of issues? How should it be possible to call a referendum? So at the moment in the UK, essentially we have a referendum if Parliament decides that it would like a referendum to take place. Should it be that it's easier to hold a referendum? So in some countries, for example, a minority within the Parliament can call a referendum in order to try to get a public decision that goes against the will of the majority within the Parliament. In some countries also, it's possible for citizens directly to call a referendum through a petitioning process. Would it be desirable to do something like that, or would it conversely be desirable to make it harder to call a referendum? Joe was hinting at the fact that some, at least, in the last 2 years have been thinking that actually referendums are not the democratic instruments that they have been thought of in the past. So perhaps we should make it harder to call a referendum. Then there are broader questions around the processes that might precede a decision to call a referendum. So is it really desirable just to decide on a whim that let's have a referendum on a big issue and then we have a referendum? Or is it better actually to have a process of thinking through, is a referendum actually the right way of tackling some questions? Or might there be another way of engaging public opinion in thinking through an issue? Some of you will be aware that I've been doing a lot of work recently on the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, which is a different way of bringing in public opinion and informed public deliberation on an issue. So would it sometimes be appropriate to have a conversation around maybe a referendum isn't the right approach, maybe a different way of engaging public information, public involvement would be better. Similarly, maybe that it would be good to have discussions around what exactly is the issue? What's the thing that we want people to vote on? What are the options that should be on the ballot paper? And another question under this heading there is, to use the jargon, should referendums be pre-legislative or post-legislative? So if we think back to the AV referendum, that referendum took place after legislation had been passed that set out what an alternative vote electoral system would look like. And if a majority had voted for change, then the minister simply had to commence to implement that legislation. So it was entirely clear what would happen in the event of a vote for change. It had already been passed into law. It was a post-legislative referendum. By contrast, something like the EU referendum was pre-legislative. There was no legislation saying what would happen in the event of a vote for change. So, famously, what Brexit involves is uncertain, but even what the process towards Brexit would be was uncertain. The Prime Minister was saying he would immediately invoke Article 50. That didn't happen. Some Leave campaigners were saying that we don't need Article 50 at all, we don't need to invoke it. Clearly that didn't happen either. So there was a lot more uncertainty about what the consequences of a vote for change would be. So would it be desirable just to have post-legislative referendums? It would mean things would be clearer, but on the other hand, how do you get a vote on EU membership if you think that that's an issue that should be voted on, if you don't go through it in a pre-legislative way, if you don't have a vote before you go through the process of negotiation? So there's some big and complex questions there. And at the bottom there, how should a referendum fit into the wider decision-making process? And this gets at the issue of, we have referendums, but we have them within what fundamentally is a representative system of government. So how should these parts relate to one another? Should we think of referendums as supplanting or as supplementing the role of Parliament within that system? In the EU referendum and in the AV referendum, Parliament basically said, okay, we give this decision over to voters. Parliament didn't want the change, the majority in Parliament didn't support the change in either case. But Parliament decided to give the decision over to voters. So essentially it was saying, we take ourselves out of this decision. An alternative view would be to say, actually for major changes, it's important that you go through a multi-stage process and you're really confident that the change is desirable before you make that decision. So in Ireland, for example, a constitutional change has to go through Parliament, through the Oireachtas, and then it goes to a referendum. So both of those decision points can veto the change if they want to. It makes it harder rather than easier to achieve change. So what kind of role do we want for referendums in the UK? So that's all the first point in the terms of reference. Then the second point relates to the legal effect of referendums. And here in particular we're thinking about whether there should be thresholds or other kinds of safeguards beyond a simple majority in order to ensure that you can't have really major change being implemented on the basis of a very narrow vote. And quite a few people in the last couple of years in the UK have talked about the desirability of having perhaps some kind of supermajority threshold. So maybe we need 60% vote for change before you implement change. Well, that certainly makes it harder to have change that doesn't clearly have wide support. But on the other hand, what would have happened had in the EU referendum we said, okay, 52% of you have voted for that, but we're just going to ignore that because it didn't pass 60%. What would have been the political implications of making that the procedure? It could have been pretty difficult as it's done. So, 2 minutes only. So there are problems there. And actually very few referendums have a supermajority threshold if you look around the world. Much more common are either turnout thresholds or electorate thresholds. So turnout threshold says that a certain percentage of the electorate have to take part in the vote before it is valid. Electorate threshold says a certain percentage of those eligible to vote have to vote for it before change can take place. Those have attractions, but on the other hand, in effect, you're counting people who don't vote as voting no, which is perhaps an unfair assumption. Some places also require what in the UK would be a multiple national thresholds. In Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, perhaps some number of those have all to vote for a change before it goes through. But can we really have that in a non-federal system? The Commission is considering another approach, which would be a double referendum process, where if you're going to enact major change, then perhaps that needs to be supported twice through 2 referendums, or at least some kind of conditional process where if there isn't a very clear majority in one referendum, you go to a second referendum. Would that be an easier way of doing things? Or do you simply rely on what I mentioned previously, the idea that you have a parliamentary decision process and then a referendum decision process? I should move on quickly. Role of government. Should governments be able to promote their own viewpoint in a referendum campaign? This was very controversial in the EU referendum, of course. Many people think it obvious that government should not be able to promote a particular viewpoint, but there are counter-arguments to that as well. If we do think the government should be constrained, there are also big questions about how do you do that effectively? Do we need a longer time period? Do we need better procedures for monitoring, penalties for non-compliance, etc.? The role of designated campaigners is really important in how we run referendums in the UK, but that's very unusual. No other countries have any system quite similar. So is it desirable that we do designate campaign groups that receive lots of extra public funding and attention? If it is it a good thing that we just have one on each side, or does that lead to polarisation of the debate? Would it be better to have a greater plurality of voices who receive some form of designation and support? And again, there are questions around processes of choosing these. There were some problems, particularly in the EU referendum around that. And finally, if Meg will allow me a little bit of time, the question of the quality of information and debate during referendum campaigns is clearly really important and has caused a lot of concern. So is it possible to promote better information and debate during campaigns? There are basically 3 kinds of approach that have been suggested for improving this. One is just ban misinformation, ban false and misleading statements. It sounds attractive when you first hear it, or in some ways it sounds attractive, but would it really work? Can you do it? And what are the freedom of speech implications around doing that? Another approach is to try to provide better quality public information, to have a detailed public information campaign in order to ensure that there is good information available and broadcasters and others can draw on that information in their coverage. But is it possible to do that well in a genuinely neutral way, and in a way that will be perceived as neutral, particularly in the UK's adversarial political culture? And then finally, beyond just having kind of top-down provision of information, are there ways in which people can be engaged more directly in deliberation and discussion during campaigns? There are some ideas around the world that have been tried for doing this that work quite well in some contexts. But again, there's a question of would they work here in the UK given our very particular political culture and our media culture, which links on to what Sue will talk about.
Thank you very much, Alan. As you can see, there are lots of questions, and I guess Sue will give us her reflections on some of those questions, but hopefully not all of them. Maybe her reflections on the Commission as a whole. Thanks, Sue.
I'm very good at keeping to time, being a broadcaster, so you don't have to wait for the little stop notice. So thank you very much for inviting me to come. It's a pleasure to be here. You've heard Jo and Alan outlining how we work and the issues we're grappling with, and really most of them come back to the question of how referendums fit into our democracy, and what's the best way of ensuring that referendums play positively in democracy and aren't just a cause of division and disillusionment. It's a big task. The Commission is intense and fascinating. We're incredibly grateful for the intellectual support from people like Alan and Jess, who writes up all our ramblings over a long meeting into something which seems to make some sort of sense. It's very collaborative and it's very positive, given the fact that there's a rather wide range of different opinions there. but we've got some pretty tough decisions to make when it comes to deciding what the recommendations are. Now, you may wonder what I'm doing on such an august and highly qualified body as the Commission, and it's actually a question I asked myself when Alan got in touch with me. What on earth do they want me for? Well, my background is as a broadcast journalist. I've been a broadcast journalist for quite a long time. And for 10 years, up until 2015, I was in charge of the BBC's political programme, so I was responsible for political news on television, radio and online, and programmes like The Mars Show and Question Time. And I was also responsible for election and referendum coverage and for the results programmes. I actually left the BBC a few months before the EU referendum, so I watched that as a viewer, not as a programme maker, which was both frustrating but very educational, a different perspective, I think we could say. So really, my interest is very much in what the role of information in democracy and in referendums. What role does the media play? And of course, one of the subjects on our agenda is regulation of the media, both old and new, during referendum campaigns, and what changes might be needed in view of criticism of recent referendum campaigns, but also increasingly the challenges of the new media landscape. So I'm just going to run through a few of the issues that the BBC and other broadcasters face at the moment, given the current regulation. The BBC and all broadcasters, as I'm sure you know, have a legal requirement for what's called due impartiality. And for each referendum, the BBC and Ofcom draws up a set of guidelines to be used by journalists and programme makers. And those guidelines are published, and the broadcasters can be held to account for a failure to abide by the guidelines. For the BBC, the aim in a referendum is to achieve what's described as broad balance, which is a way of leaving its editors the freedom to make editorial judgments while achieving an overall consistency in the levels of coverage for each side in the referendum. Broad balance does not mean absolute equality of time, and it's not measured by a stopwatch. Also, the coverage needs to include not just the designated campaign groups, but a range of different views on both sides of the argument. It's worth noting as well that the designated campaign groups do not have a right to dictate who appears on different programmes. You may remember during the EU referendum campaign there was a bit of a row when ITV asked Nigel Farage to appear on their debate, which upset Vote Leave a great deal. And it's just worth noting that it is up to the broadcasters to decide who they invite to appear on their programmes. I think referendums are a particular challenge for broadcasters, much more so than elections, and that's because it's such a binary choice, and you find that both sides very rapidly become entrenched in their positions and opinions are very polarised. And even more than in an election, it seems to me that it's harder for people to acknowledge that different points of view should be heard. Now, I think a lot of the criticism over the quality of information in recent referendums is how well the media interrogated claims which were made on both sides of the campaign. And quite often those claims were what you would describe as forecasts of what might happen, as opposed to anything kind of concrete that you could really get your hands on. I think the use of statistics was a particularly vexed issue. The BBC had Reality Check, Channel 4 News had Full Fact, both of which robustly scrutinised the rival claims, including Vote Leave's infamous 350 million, or is it now, according to Boris, 450 million? And Remain's claim, which was equally dubious, that leaving the EU would cost every British household £4,400. The other big criticism, I think, that was made of broadcasters was that they somehow presented what was described as a false balance between the opposing views, which meant that they failed to inform the public properly. Other people, of course, point to the increasing public scepticism about experts and the tendency for people to hear only the arguments which they want to hear. That is confirmation bias. Sometimes, I have to say, I think it's hard to distinguish the criticism from the conclusion that it comes primarily from people who are unhappy with the result of the referendum. Now, the Commission has discussed whether it's possible to regulate truth in a campaign and whether there is a role for a neutral arbiter of truth. I have some doubts about that, and I think if such an organisation existed, it would require huge levels of public trust to be valuable. We've also discussed whether print journalism should be subject to more stringent balance rules over and above those that are currently required by IPSO, and Sarah may well want to talk about that. But whatever the problems of the so-called old media, I think there is growing concern about the role of digital and social media in referendum campaigns, where there is really little or no regulation or transparency. And with 80% of adults now using social media, that is a huge concern. If you haven't ever read any of his blogs, Dominic Cummings, who is a very influential figure in the Vote Leave campaign, is definitely worth a look at. I'm just going to quote you a couple of things from a blog that he wrote after the campaign. He said, in the official 10-week campaign, we served about 1 billion targeted digital adverts, mostly via Facebook, strongly weighted to the period around postal voting and the last 10 days of the campaign. We ran many different versions of ads, tested them, dropped the less effective and reinforced the most effective. One of the reasons why so few people in London saw the result coming was that use by campaigns of data is hard to track even if you know what to look for, and few in politics or the media know what to look for. So one of the things that we're looking at is, should paid political advertising online be banned? Or should it at least be required to be clearly identified as political advertising to ensure complete transparency? The issue of data is also a critical one, and something that we've discussed. Data collected by social media platforms is an incredibly valuable tool if you want to target political messaging. But how should you regulate that? And if you do regulate it, how can you assess the cost of the data gathered outside a referendum period, and how can that then be properly accounted for by the relevant campaign? There's also an issue about how social media users access the accuracy of news, which appears in their timelines. I think Facebook have recently announced changes to their algorithm, which will apparently reward content which encourages people to discuss and share rather than paid for content. But quite how that works in a referendum campaign, I think, remains to be seen. I think there's a growing feeling that social media platforms will end up being regulated in some ways in the same way as broadcasters are, and that their claim to be simply a platform for other people's content is no longer really sustainable. And the Commons Select Committee on Culture, Media and Sport are currently looking at that precise issue. I'm not going to invoke Meg's wrath, so I'm going to finish right there, but of course I haven't even got onto the subject of Russian bots in the EU referendum. Whoever would have thought that sentence could be part of a seminar on an independent commission on referendums? The whole world.
Terrific, Sue, thank you. And over to Sarah for some outside reflections.
Thank you very much, Meg, and thank you for having me here. I'm not an expert on referendums. In fact, I'm glad Sir Joe told me what the plural was in academic circles, because I'd often wondered about that. But what I am is somebody who, as deputy editor of the Sunday Times, has run our referendum coverage. And as with Sue, I know that for the media, you can talk all you like about balance, but a referendum is a blood sport. The EU itself, whether we should stay or leave, is not. That can be extremely boring for readers. But the idea of a straight yes, no, remain, leave vote is a wonderful way to excite attention, energise your readers, get them into camps. And at the Sunday Times, we had, our readers were pretty well split down the middle, so I tried my hardest to commission articles that would reflect both sides of the debate, but even at their most rarefied, they were presented as for or against. So, for example, we had Tony Blair making the case for remaining in the EU on the one side of the page with a big, versus David Owen making the case for leave on the other side of the page. So you're trying to simplify very complex issues, and it is always presented as a battle. Now, Sir Joe talked about, it was the EU referendum was the great unmentionable, but of course we talked of little else for those weeks, and it's precisely because it's such a good debating point. And I certainly agree with you, Alan, that it's very difficult to say that if to have, say, a 60-40 split or anything like that, because you can imagine the polarisation if the 52% who voted Leave had been ignored. There's enough sort of bitterness and debate around the elites, and even now you can see echoes of it with the idea that somehow or other the will of the people will still be frustrated, and there will be some way to make us remain despite our historic vote, etc. So energy is already being whipped up into a bit of a frenzy about that, and even though, as far as I can see, the government is still very much on the course to leave. And the one thing I think Theresa May said, however weak her hand, was that Brexit means Brexit, and one way or the other, we are on our way out. Now, all this factionalism, polarisation, though well suited to the broadsheet and tabloid media, is even better suited to the social media. And I think that Sue made some excellent points there, because, and you don't even need Russian bots, because people are polarising the message without them. There's something about social media that definitely creates tension, because all the things that go viral are, in a sense, argumentative. And we saw with Microsoft's experiment with a chatbot Tay, that it very quickly degenerated from, hi, how are you, and I'm feeling good, into Holocaust denial and racism and homophobia, etc. Because you put poison in, it will start to sort of accelerate. And I mean, the amazing thing is, we've been hearing about what should be the role of the government, etc. Should the government go into purdah? The government to withdraw from this arena would be grossly irresponsible, in my view, because it would leave the field to all the other players on social media elsewhere. And I think, we certainly saw that a lot of campaigns spent money on promotional leaflets, and that was a huge waste of money. I don't think anyone reads their leaflets anymore. They go straight in the bin and into recycling. But people are glued to their social media feeds. And frankly, even to get rid of paid advertising wouldn't do it, because people are sharing all kinds of stuff amongst their family and friends, particularly at these times. So no matter what, in a quiet time, Facebook can remove sort of news content, etc., which is in itself controversial. But I know, for example, my husband, who went to a school in Birmingham where 95% of the people that he was still in touch with voted Leave, was a very good corrective to me in my media bubble in London as to how people were really going to vote. And he was discovering it on his Facebook feed, so it was coming from family and friends. It wasn't just who's paying for it and who's been using it. But they were also circulating information from areas you wouldn't even believe, like InfoWars in the United States, or so it's not just that they're circulating stuff that's put in front of their nose. So this is something absolutely enormous. Can we get round it by having a pre and post referendum so that people can sort of vote in haste and repent maybe at leisure at the end of it, or when they see what the deal is on offer? I don't even think that's going to settle things, because then we'll have people demanding, well, surely it's got to be the best of three. And I was a political reporter in the lobby in Parliament in the 90s, which was dominated by the Maastricht Treaty. And it's the same crowd then of the people that John Major called bastards, who are still very much leading lights in the Brexit movement today. People will not give up just because they've had a vote. So, and I don't suppose the Remainers will either. But all the time, the EU is changing. So I think it's by no means clear, for example, that Remain would win if people finally woke up to the economic challenges. What's going on in Europe? No German government, very authoritarian governments, very hostile to migrants developing in Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. EU itself is not remaining the same while we're changing. So there's, you know, you can't guarantee that that sort of repent at leisure vote is going to work. In the end, though, despite all the storm and fury around the actual vote, the actual business of leaving the EU, I think, is a lot less, although very complicated, is probably not so subject to the immediate push and pull of the media that we're seeing. So that, you know, you're hearing one side denounce this angrily, another side denounce that angrily. Meanwhile, the Sherpas are doing their negotiations, etc., and probably, just as with the payment bill of about 40 billion to the EU, things are being agreed behind the scenes quietly and then announced. So the final outcome will probably be a lot more of a negotiated compromise than some of the noisy arguments we hear. But I do think, I mean, referenda are very interesting phenomenon. I enjoy them as a member of the media, and we've had a great run with the Scottish referendum as well. But I do think that they can really distort an argument, and that's something that we have to decide that it's worth it on the big issues or not. I think it probably is, but we have to be alive to those dangers, and they're very considerable.